Hello, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to the Southampton Chamber of Commerce Chamber of Solutions. This is our second Chamber of Solutions meeting. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Neil Garwood. I'm going to be the host for today, and in my spare time I'm the Managing Director at Southampton Airport. Very briefly, the Southampton Chamber of Commerce is the voice for business in the Southampton City region. We aim to provide a voice for all the businesses across the region, to provide opportunities to share, to learn, and to develop. And hopefully this session today and the Chamber of Solutions series itself will give multiple opportunities to do that. These sessions are designed for you. They're local, they're practical, and I hope today there will be plenty of opportunities for questions to be asked and for ideas to be shared. The specific topic today is practical HR solutions, and we're going to be looking at getting back to work after the peak of COVID-19. So let's take a very quick look at the agenda for today's session. In a moment, I'll be handing over to Steph Barnett. Steph is the Managing Director of Pure Human Resources, and Steph will be talking about those practical solutions that are designed to help businesses and employees get back to work after the crisis that we have seen in recent months. And then we'll be asking Amy Allen, and Amy is the Compliance Manager from Meach's Global Logistics. And Amy will give us a case study of how that firm have managed the return of employees into normal business. Throughout the course of the discussion, you will notice a couple of things. First of all, there are no cameras turned on and no sound turned on for any attendees. That's purely done to minimise any bandwidth issues and also to direct focus into the presentations themselves. But we really would welcome questions to be asked. So please, if you have any questions you'd like to ask or points you'd like to raise, you can use the public chat function to the left-hand side of the screen. Type your message in, hit enter, and the question will appear. And I'll then try and direct those to Steph or to Amy later on in the session today. So as we work through the impact of COVID-19 and as we live with lockdown, today's session, a great opportunity for us to understand some of those HR elements around bringing people back to work and bringing businesses back online, something that we are all so keen to do as we look ahead to a bright, hopefully, and a successful future. So I'm going to hand over to Steph now, who's going to kick us off today and take the next part of the presentation to start to really talk about those HR solutions that will help business in the weeks and months ahead. Over to you, Steph.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Just upload the presentation. So welcome everybody. Yes, we're going to be talking about some practical tips to see you through. Obviously, a lot of you have probably had a lot of time thinking about what this means, and it's now putting some of those steps into place. So just as a little bit of by way of introduction, my name's Steph Barnett. I'm from Hampshire originally, went away for a little bit and came back, but I've worked in HR for over 25 years, so hopefully you'll feel that I've got the credibility to be able to give you some advice this morning. I'm actually a fellow of the CIPD, which is our industry body. So CIPD is done by exam, and then fellow is based on tenure and experience that you've had to date. And I suppose what probably makes me and my team at Pure Human Resources a little bit different is that we have completed advanced certificates in employment law. So I did mine back in 2008. So it just allows us to think at things from a legal perspective as well as an HR perspective, and really talk to people around the risks and some of the challenges that may face their organisation. So worked in industry for the bulk of my career in a variety of different sectors. I started out as a subsidiary of Thames Water, more latterly finishing as an HRD in a pharmaceutical company. So I guess the thing that's really important to me in the advice that we give is it's that practical element. It's trying to understand the challenges as business owners that you face and coming up with not a textbook answer, but something that's useful for you. So I set up Pure Human Resources nearly 8 years ago. And one of the things that's really important to me is I keep that board position that I've had previously. So I've got a couple of non-exec director roles within charities. So again, it's appreciating really what things mean from an individual perspective, but also a company perspective. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to be talking about re-engaging staff. This is that lovely word that gets used over and over again, an unprecedented situation. We've never faced anything like this in our working lives. Touch wood, hopefully never will again, but we don't know. So it's understanding around some of the practical tech steps that we're going to have to take to do that. Likewise, from a safety perspective, obviously I'll cover some aspects, but Amy will go into more detail with her case study specifically around how Meters have dealt with that. Communication, one of those things that always gets forgotten about and you can never do enough of from an employee's perspective. So how you can weave that into some of your plans to re-engage yourself back into the workplace. Likewise, what you need to do from a practical perspective from your audit trail. What data do you need to be keeping? What records, what information, what's the best way to do that? So we've got a bit of a checklist there that you can follow. Learning and development. So, most of us going into this situation have probably never been through any crisis management training. Likewise, you probably haven't got mental health first aiders in your workplace. So some of the challenges that managers and individuals are going to be faced going forward with, and thinking about some of the things that you might want to apply to your business as a bit of a plan to really get back up to speed. And then I guess that the R word, right sizing, redundancy, whatever you want to call it, we'll have a look at some of those things that might apply to your business going forward. I have to say probably it's the most frequent conversation I've had with our clients over the last 3 weeks. There's a lot of businesses contemplating, a few have committed, but most people are just kind of playing around with the different options at the moment. So we'll talk about what that would involve, what you'd need to think about, what you need to plan, and again some practical steps of things that you'd need to do to put in place to do things if you need to get to that stage. So just moving on, looking at the physical return to work. So again, as I say, a situation we've never been faced with before, completely new set of circumstances. Until the 20th of March, the vast majority of the UK public had never even heard of the word furlough. And so here we are, some weeks later, having to kind of go through the process of unfurloughing people. So just a bit of a background really. So furloughing is a really common term that's used in the US. It's also used in quite a lot of European countries, but not something that's been used in the UK before. And obviously, one of the things that's really important is that the contract of employment still continues. We obviously had the job retention scheme that was introduced very quickly, very effectively. And we now have it in its current format through to the end of July. We do know that it's going to be extended from August through to October. We don't know the details. There's lots and lots of speculation. I get asked this question frequently, and genuinely there is no guidance as to what we know that's likely to be, other than we are expecting employers to take a proportion of that, and there is a suggestion that you may be able to return people on a part-time basis. The main thing is obviously watch this space, where we've been promised some guidance by the end of May, so that will very much be the position and where you need to look for that. So what we know about the scheme at the moment, probably a lot of organisations have been doing this already. You can make the claim online. You can cover up to 80% of the employee's salary, up to a maximum of $2,500 per month, and that includes pensions, auto-enrolment levels, and your employer's NI. Relatively easy to make a claim online, unless you've got quite a lot of number of employees up to 100. Once you get to 100, it's a lot easier. And the important bit from my perspective, if I kind of put my HR hat on, is that you need to get individuals' consent to go into furlough status. So, that might be as simple as having a letter that gets a signature on. And the reason being is that you have a contract of employment with your employee. It says you promise to give them work, and in return you promise to pay them money at 100% of what's detailed in the contract. If you are then furloughing your staff, you need to get their agreement to change their salary and not to offer them work. So the same principle applies when you're unfurloughing staff. What I would suggest is you probably need an unfurloughing letter. Please email us if you need a copy. We're giving those out free. They're probably pretty much Google and find them, but something that gives notice to the individual that they're returning. Because we've never had furlough before, there are no specific guidance in terms of the amount of notice you need to give. Personally, I would say a minimum of 24 hours. But likewise, I would think about, so our professional body, for instance, the CIPD is suggesting 48 hours. Think about some of the challenges that people are going to have when they come back to work, particularly if they've been furloughed. So some people are scared. They just don't know what this new world looks like. They have probably been cocooned with their immediate family for some time, quite apprehensive about going out, might not have even been to shops, might have been having online deliveries. So fear is quite a big factor. Likewise, you may have somebody who's still shielding, so how to deal with those. So obviously the statutory sick pay scheme is still available. Should you need to unfurlough your staff and get people back to work, it might be that you keep odd instances whereby people are still furloughed as the exception rather than the bulk. There are some people who don't want to return because they've got a little bit used to furlough. I know that kind of been suggested to the government, and certainly we've seen examples of where that's been the case, where employers have rung us and said, looking to unfurlough all my staff, and suddenly somebody has decided to shield because their partner's pregnant, and we've kind of talked through steps around those. And I think as long as you're empathetic to the person's circumstances and understand what's going on, there are ways around this. So it might be actually that in this particular instance we had one gentleman who clearly had got a little bit too used to furlough, and we suggested, well, he might be eligible for statutory sick pay instead of use shielding, and miraculously came back to work very quickly. So there are various things to do, but it's understanding each situation and treating each person as an individual. Generally, I think there's going to be some real struggles with mental health as a result of this. So think about people who've been at home. Some people have great resilience. Some people are really struggling with coping strategies. A personal one which I struggle with is the whole balance of homeschooling and childcare. Obviously until children are back at school and nurseries are open, whatever your views on that situation, grandparents able to look after children again, it's a real practical challenge for lots of people around the mechanics of working, whether that's still working at home if they've been doing that before, or actually leaving the home and going back to a workplace. So I think you just need to have a think about things and treat people as individuals is quite an important point. And the synergy I would use is think what the children are like when they've had 6 weeks off in the school holidays. That whole anticipation, psyching everybody else up, going shoe shopping, the momentum of building. We see the same thing when people have been on a long-term sick. It's the mechanics. It causes quite a lot of anxiety, and I think you need to just appreciate that every single person is different. We don't know what that's going to look like for different people. So obviously the unfurloughing itself, we'll see how the mechanics of that roll out going forward. But just bear in mind that different people have different expectations of what that new world looks like at work. And certainly, people may completely embrace that because they're really desperate to see colleagues again. I don't think there's anything wrong with thinking about a return to work plan. And by that, I don't mean sort of war and peace. It could just be some bullet points. It could be a checklist. In the same way you would induct somebody into your business, think about the things that might have changed whilst they've been off. It's quite a long period of time, particularly if you as a business owner and or some other people have been continuing to work during this duration. If you've had a proportion of your workforce at work and a proportion furloughed, then the chances are in the last 10 weeks, quite a lot will have actually changed. And that might be, circumstances have changed in terms of you might have diversified or whatever that might be. So think about just a checklist in terms of maybe some events that have happened, any new systems or technology, and treat it as a return to work interview from somebody who's been on sick or a mini induction scheme. So we've kind of dealt with the physical aspect. So I think the hardest thing is re-engaging staff. I've seen some polls going around on LinkedIn around, do people want to come back? And overwhelmingly, I think most people miss the social aspect of work. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, whilst the vast majority of the world's population needs to work financially to bring home money, we choose where to work, and that quite often is influenced by what we do, but most predominantly who we work with. So that's really important, and that you understand that. Different people have had different challenges, and I think that's the thing. You might have somebody who's lost a relative. You might have somebody who elderly parents are being shielded and they can't get access to them, and they normally provide them with care. They might have money problems at home, which you don't see because people don't tend to talk about it. You might have a partner who's at risk of redundancy, already been made redundant. So there's all sorts of different things going on. And the one thing we find from our perspective is there are lots of mechanics you can put in place to make sure that you are legally compliant. The one bit that tends to get forgotten about when people go into these sorts of processes is forgetting that people are individuals, and at the end of the day, if you can win their hearts and minds on a process, even if something's bad news, it makes the impact of a situation far more successful. You know, certainly having looked at and having done very large scale redundancies in the past, if you can get people's buy-in to understanding why it's happening and to look after them and to treat them with respect and to doing what you say you're going to do, that really makes an enormous difference in terms of implementing anything. So, you know, the same in terms of bringing people back. It's just thinking through those sorts of things. And certainly in my time as an HR director, you know, we went for, as an organisation, we achieved Sunday Times Top 100 status. So lots of things around employee engagement and lots of tools and techniques. But the one thing that people always complain about, regardless, is that you never communicate enough. So even when you're in that kind of top echelon of being seen as a really good employer, you will still get employees going, well, you didn't tell me this, I don't know what's going on. And that can be because people filter information, they don't understand what's being said, as well as just they're listening out for one piece of information and they're not getting that one little nugget that applies to them. So from a personal perspective, I would say just talk and keep talking. It's really important that you do those things. One of the things that you might want to think about, if you haven't got in place already, is something like an employee assistance program. Certainly one of the challenges your manager is going to have, and we'll touch that on in a moment, is they're not trained probably in most instances as mental health first aiders, and you want them to be employed as managers. So from that perspective, some people are going to need a mechanism by which they can alleviate some of the challenges that they have, whether it's talking to somebody, whether it's getting some counselling, whether it's getting some advice on money situations and so on. So certainly if you haven't got something like an employee assistance program in place already, it's certainly something I would put on your list. Health Assured, for instance, are the leading UK provider. We're a partner if you want some details. They're very cost-effective solutions. You can cover a lot of people at a very low price, but they just give your employees and their families access to something like a 24/7 contact that they can go, they can get that information, they can arrange face-to-face counselling, albeit probably Zoom or you know, socially distanced methodology at the moment. But it just means that the focus is on the individual being able to take responsibility for some of the challenges they have, and managers not being drawn into that kind of counsellor mode and being able to concentrate on managing. Likewise, everybody's probably a little bit sensitive, and one of the things that often comes out with employees in these sorts of situations is around fairness. So think about, again, when you communicate why you're doing things, and you know, if there are exceptions such as shielding individuals, that you make that kind of message clear. Obviously, you're not expecting to go into medical details and breach GDPR, but think about how you communicate in those messages that you send out to people. So I'm only going to touch on this one lightly because obviously Amy's got a great case study that she's going to take through. We do know that obviously the government has published guidance. So we've got 8 different current workplaces for which there's been specific guidance provided. So that's construction and outdoor activities, factories, plants and warehouses, laboratories and research facilities, office and contact centres, other people's homes, for instance, if you've got cleaners or care arrangements, restaurants offering takeaway and delivery, shops and branches, and vehicles. So there are specific guidance for each of those sectors which are available from the government, if you want to click on those and have a look. So you need to obviously think about your sector, have a look and do that research around what's appropriate to you, and you need to then assess risk assess and then manage those situations, and that's obviously something that Amy will talk through in more detail. Some of the challenges more from an HR perspective is, you know, are you going to need to think about changing working hours? Are you going to need to think about shifts? You're going to need to change the location that people work at. One of the challenges from a contractual perspective is that most of your contracts will probably say they work from a fixed location and these are their hours. So anytime you want to vary anything, you need to talk to people and you need to get their consent to do so. Or if you're going to need to make that forced change upon them, then you're going to need to get some help around consulting with individuals to make those sorts of changes. So moving on. HR data. I think this is one of the things we get asked a lot. It's quite operational, very tactical. It applies to all businesses, and it's a real challenge. So from our perspective, the furloughing records are really, really important. As I say, you obviously needed to get an individual's consent to go on to furlough. So whatever methodology you've used, you're going to need to keep those records. Certainly from my perspective, at some time in the future, HMRC are going to be knocking on a lot of doors and doing a lot of audits around this kind of piece of work to see where there have been breaches. So you need to keep those documentation and how you're going to store it. And hopefully you've got an employee signature on a bit of paper, whether it's electronically or a physical hard copy. Likewise, as I say, think about unfurloughing letter, just again gaining consent from the individual and bringing them back into that status. We get lots of questions about holidays. So fundamentally, holiday continues to accrue as per your contract of employment whilst you're on furlough. So all this time we've been off, everybody has continued to accrue what they've got in their contract. And if you pay something in line with the working time regulations, legally that comes to 5.6 weeks, which sounds a bit bizarre, but in most industries that will equate to 20 days plus 8 bank holidays. As we know, there's no legal entitlement to bank holidays, so you might put those 28 in a pot, but that's the legal minimum that you have to offer for somebody working full-time hours. And traditionally, under the working time regulations, you have never been able to carry forward any holiday from one year to the next. Working time regulations are a piece of health and safety legislation, and the idea is that you take holiday to be rest and recuperate from your workplace. So we do know that rule's been extended, so you can now carry over holiday for up to a 2-year period or 24 months from when it was due to be taken. So as you can start to see, you're already going to have the mechanics of how you keep your holiday records are going to get a little bit more complicated in terms of if you've got lots of bits of paper and how you're going to manage those for lots of businesses. So you've got the carryover. You might have had people who've booked holiday and cancelled it because they can't go away and they don't want to use it. They'd rather carry on working and they've been working from home. You might have people who want to have holiday because maybe they've been furloughed but they wanted 100% of pay, and that's a really important one to think about if you've had people who've furloughed but you've had bank holidays, because if your contract says you're entitled to a bank holiday, you have to have paid that at 100%, so you might need to make a retrospective payment on that, or you could, for instance, recredit the individual with the holiday. Likewise, if you've got a contractual provision for a shutdown, that's obviously something you can give notice to do. We get lots of questions around, can you force people to take holiday? Again, it goes back to what's in your contract of employment. If you reserve the right to do that, then probably yes, you'd still need to give reasonable notice. The default position on holiday notice is double the length of duration. So if you want people, normally if people want to take a 2-week holiday with you, then they need to give you 4 weeks holiday. And the same with you if you want to enforce holiday on them. But certainly if you haven't got a provision in your contract that says we have a shutdown period, then I'd get some advice on that. That's something you need to think about, otherwise you may have a breach of contract issue. So the mechanics of how to monitor, likewise, you've got changes in working hours, shifts, locations. So lots of people talking about, can I, reduce people's salaries? Can I reduce people's hours? All those sorts of things. All those things you need to keep records on. We'll probably come on to the mechanics of how to do that in a moment, but you need to keep your audit trail. And certainly from my perspective, when things go wrong and we pick up things with the client, the biggest challenge we have is pulling together that audit trail to see what happened when, and that's really important, so that if something does go wrong and you need to defend it as an employer, you can show what conversations you had, what letters you did. An email's a great thing because you can just literally drop somebody an email going, just following on from our conversation, this is what we agreed as an outcome. It's date and time stamp, so it's really important. And probably more than ever, things like setting targets and performance measures are really important. And I don't mean performance managing somebody. I mean giving them some goals and some aspirations. As human beings, we perform better, typically with carrot rather than stick, if you can engage people at the right level. And certainly there's a motivational aspect around getting their buy-in to what's going on with the organisation in the future. What's your your revised plans, your revised strategy of where you're going to go, and putting something in real time around what that means to them. So what have they got to achieve to kind of buy into that bigger picture? And certainly if you haven't got any way of recording some of that documentation, certainly my recommendation would be to look at something like an HR cloud-based software. There's lots of good packages. We're actually a Breathe partner at silver level, so if anybody would like any details of that, happy to send details out. But very cost-effective solutions, looking at £10 a month for less than 10 employees with no tie-in. And we picked Breathe because we really like it. It's got lots and lots of functionality. Certainly compared with the larger systems I would have used in the corporate world, it's got lots of really good things. Everything from For instance, if you send out a risk assessment and you want people to read and understand a new policy and to sign to acknowledge that they've received a copy, Breathe can do something like that for you. So a really cost-effective solution to really cut down on your HR administration. Likewise, you know, employees can request holiday via their phone and it goes to their manager. So again, it gets rid of all those bits of paper that are probably sliding around on your desk, so that you've got some mechanics of recording and keeping that information all in a good spot. One to watch out for is something called the Good Work Plan. It's kind of snuck in fairly quietly. Bit of a challenge for a lot of employers. So it's a fairly major legislative change from an HR perspective. I have to say it probably was quite quiet because of Brexit, and then obviously COVID's come along and kind of beaten it to it. So this lawful change happened on the 6th of April, and there are some requirements. So for instance, there will be some changes you need to have made to your contract of employment, defining certain aspects, and there will be some policies you'll need to introduce or probably update. Certainly introduction of a new parental bereavement policy, which is an entitlement to 2 weeks leave at statutory rates if an individual's child dies during their working time. So again, use this time effectively to go back and check your contracts, make any updates that you need to do. And think about sickness going forward, you know, so there are some individuals that are shielding. Obviously at the moment, people who've had shielding letters will probably cover them up until the end of June, and we need to watch this space and what that means going forward as well. But certainly there's lots of things that you can do to really ease your burden in this area. Development, we've kind of touched on some of this already. Think about your managers. They won't be used to dealing with this situation, and certainly if you're a business owner, the mindset and the challenges that you've gone through will be very different to the situations that are running through the head of that particular individual. They won't be thinking about, oh, it's really important that we save this business. They'll be thinking about what happens to my job. So make sure that your managers really are able to communicate. They've got tools available to them. They probably, as I say, won't have been through crisis management training. They probably won't be mental health first aiders. So think about, you know, are there other tools that you can give them, or what can you do to kind of get them up to speed? There's lots of support available for coaching and managing managers online. We can obviously provide some guidance in that area if you do too. Likewise, technological changes. I think, you know, obviously people have got used to Zooming and FaceTiming, you know, particularly with elderly relatives that they've never done before. But think about, you know, how you store information to make things GDPR compliant and how you manage them. And again, think about is there any training in those areas that you need to deliver to employees. Point I touched on before, certainly if the business is diversified, then that's something you may need to think about. Certainly one of our clients, who usually makes parts for Formula One, has actually diversified, and they've been making parts for ventilators. So, you know, it's communicating that to your employees, getting them to understand the changes. There might be different operating work practices. You might need to train them on those sorts of things, and think about mental health issues, because I think that's going to be a real key challenge going forward for a lot of businesses. And then as we approach the end, probably the one that most people are thinking about at the moment, it's very topical, is if you do need to make a change to your organisation. So my advice is plan it. Think about scenarios. Think about challenges. I think the biggest challenge most organisations are feeling at the moment is we don't know what the next couple of months are going to be like. We don't know what that's going to mean for your cash flow in your business. We don't know how much turnover is going to look like. And you know, you almost need to kind of go through a couple of scenarios. There are challenges in that obviously we've got the furlough scheme in place, but your employees are continue to accrue holiday and length of service whilst they're off, so hence their entitlement to different benefits from a statutory perspective are going. And certainly if people are going to go over the 2-year limit, then they will gain unfair dismissal rights as time goes by. So just think about those. My general advice is, if you think you're going to have to restructure or make people redundant, is treat this as a textbook exercise. Don't think to start off with about the people you employ. Draw the structure around what you want it to look like within your organisation. And once you understand that, then you can overlay it with the people that you've got and the skills that you've got. People will sometimes get a bit tied up in knots where they kind of go, well, you know, I'm going to keep this person here and I'll kind of create a job for them. You know, if you're going to be doing this, what you don't want to be doing is something we tend to call salami tactics, which is, you know, stage 1 redundancy, and then actually a couple of months down the line you realise they're going to have to do something else again and again, because it really unsettles people and you want to minimise that disruption to them. So, you know, you really want to think about planning that and having those steps in place. Certainly we get lots of questions about people changing terms and conditions of employment. You know, can I put people on part-time working? Can I reduce their salary? Again, it depends on what's your contract of employment. If you've got that flexibility to do that, then you still need to talk to people, but you need to get their consent. But the chances are you probably haven't got that consent in your contract, in which case you're going to need to go through consultation with individuals. And consultation is really important because you need to demonstrate that you've talked to individuals and get their agreement wherever possible around what's going to happen. And certainly if you're going into a redundancy situation, if you have between 20 and 99 redundancies you're going to do in any 30-day period, and that's a rolling 30-day period, or you're going to make 100 or more redundancies in that time period, then you need to go through what's called collective consultation. So for between 20 and 99, that's 30 days. And for 100 or more, that's 45 days. And to go through that process, you need to talk to what are called elective representatives. So you need to go through a voting process. And you need to train those representatives, and you need to consult with them around measures to avoid, reduce and mitigate the changes that you're going to need to do in your organisation. And that is possible. We've certainly done it with a couple of larger organisations we're working with. We've been doing them over the last 6-8 weeks. So it doesn't need to stop because we're not able to see people face to face. But consultation is really important. You need to, even if you're making just even 1 or 2 individuals redundant, you need to have an individual consultation meeting with them. An individual consultation can't start until collective is finished. So you need to have that meaningful conversation to say, is there a way you think we can avoid to avoid making these redundancies in this workplace, and allow them to reflect and to come back on you. What you don't need to do is you don't need to do redundancy consultation meeting 1, 2, 3, 4, but you do need to have a meaningful conversation. A lot of employers get it wrong when they calculate redundancy pay as well. So certainly you can Google something that's called a redundancy ready reckoner, which is I would always advise, and it will give you a matrix which kind of gives you age and length of service of individuals, and you look up how many weeks pay they're entitled to, and you use either their weekly pay, so that might be annual salary divided by 52, or the current cap, which is 538. So it's capped at that upper amount. And then you work out what that entitlement to. And obviously anything up to 30,000 is free of tax and national insurance. So there's no PAYE deductions from that perspective. And then separately, you also need to work out their notice pay. And that will be the opposite. That will be the greater of either what's in their contract or their statutory entitlement. So in their contract, for instance, it may say they're entitled to 1 month's salary, but if they've been with you for 7 years, then actually the greater is the 7-year aspect, of which statutory, roughly speaking, is 1 week for every completed year of service. So they've got 7 years service, they've got 4 weeks in their contract employment, it would be 7 weeks of pay you'd have to pay them. And the difference is that notice pay is paid at actual pay. And obviously, you may decide to pay them in lieu of notice, in which case that payment is taxed and then deniable. Lots of questions around, can you use the furlough scheme for notice pay? Yes, as far as we're aware at the moment, you can. There is nothing that precludes you from doing that. But obviously, if you're paying in lieu of notice, then you wouldn't be able to. So just think about sort of some of those things. And just a nice touch that you, again, kind of going back to my hearts and minds point, think about how this affects people. They've obviously, got mortgages to think about. They've got families, they've got commitments. They might have somebody else who's also at risk of redundancy. If you can help them even in a little way in terms of providing them with something like outplacement of maybe half an hour's face-to-face support, or maybe a group session of outplacement in terms of how to go about structuring their CV and their job search, for a very cost-effective price, you can actually provide something that's quite meaningful to individuals and give them a little bit extra. So that's all from me. What I would say is I'm going to pass back to Neil shortly, but if you've got questions, if you have a look on the left-hand side of your screen, there's a send a message to Neil box. You can type any questions through those, and then we'll answer them after Amy's finished her presentation.
Steph, that's fantastic, thank you. And I wondered, just before we move on to Amy, if we could just pick up one question that's come in on the chat from Sam, which is making reference to the quarantine scheme, the government's quarantine scheme. And Sam asks, when an employee or if an employee wished to take an overseas holiday and then had to isolate on their return or quarantine on their return, would the employee be asked to take a longer holiday to account for the 2 weeks of quarantine, and even what if they can't work that period from home? Could you give a quick answer to that one, and then we'll move on to Amy's?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's an interesting one because obviously the government haven't provided any guidance. So in the absence of us kind of specifics, if they're still going to be travelling abroad and they're going to come back and they physically can't work for you, technically their contract requires you to, so it would be perfectly reasonable for you to either to ask them to take holiday or to grant them unpaid leave for that time period. If you think they can work, but they can work from home and you're happy with that as an organisation, then obviously they could continue to work and you know, you just do them in the home-based environment, or potentially you have got the furlough scheme still available, or you know, if they're showing symptoms, then there's statutory sick pay which you can now claim back as an employer.
Thank you. Great answer and great presentation. I hope generated lots of interest across the listeners. And as I say, any questions, please do put them in on the public chat, and we'll cover them off at the end of today's session. So I'm now going to hand over to Amy Allen. Amy's the compliance manager at Meachers Global Logistics, as you can see on the screen. Should have just mentioned two other very quick points. If you'd like to make the screen a little bit bigger and the chat page to be removed, then you can click the head and shoulders at the top of the top left of the screen, and that can remove the chat page if you're looking on a smaller screen. And also, if you'd like to download a copy of the presentation, and we'll bring Steph's back up again at the end, then you can click the download arrow at the very bottom left hand of the slides, and that will download the slide pack for you. So I'll now hand over to Amy, and Amy's going to give us a case study of how Meachers have approached the challenges of bringing employees back to work in the face of the COVID-19 challenge. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks, Neil. Good afternoon. I'm from Meachers Global Logistics, and we're a transport, warehousing and freight forwarding company in Southampton. I'm here today to talk to you about how we're getting our staff back to work by putting in place precautionary measures to try and keep everyone who comes onto our premises safe. Before we did anything, we completed a risk assessment. So this made us think thoroughly about the areas of risk in our business, and it was while we were completing our risk assessment that the government created their working safely with COVID-19 guidance, which is absolutely brilliant and can be used as a great baseline for any of your risk assessments that you're going to make. It gives specific advice about how to get back to work safely, and for us, 3 of the guides were relevant, so factories, plants, warehouses, office and contact centres, and finally vehicles. So I've included a web address for that at the end of my presentation in case anyone needs that. So to create some structure to my presentation, I've broken it down into 5 steps to creating a risk assessment. So step 1, what is the hazard? So we all know what the hazard is by now. That's the reason for being here today. The spread of COVID-19 and with symptoms that could for the majority be mild, moderate, or in the worst case, for those with underlying health conditions, it could be fatal. So who will it affect? So it's a global pandemic. It can affect everyone, from your cleaners to your staff, to visitors, and then to subsequent friends and families. So you've probably all seen this before. It's our hierarchy of risk control. And this is how we would start to think about eliminating or minimising exposure to hazards. So eliminating the hazard is obviously preferable, but you can use PPE as one of your last measures. So step 3, evaluating the risk and any precautions. So this is a risk that we can't completely eliminate, so we need to think about how it could spread through the premises, through our business activities, and then what we would need to do to stop the spread. So we also needed to think about people who are of higher risk, that require more controls than others, and areas such as communal areas, which would be of higher risk because of the amount of people that are using them. And then we needed to think about the precautions that we could reasonably put in place. So these actions will be our controls, which will reduce the risk of spread. So for us, this is some of the precautions that we have put in place. So we are continuing to have staff work from home, but the key for us is getting them back to work. We have plans for the high risk. So we've furloughed many until the end of July, but we need to have them back as soon as possible, and when it is obviously safe to do so. So we've put in the below measures with them in mind. So we have reviewed our office layout. So a lot of our offices, I'm sure like many, will be at absolute maximum capacity. So we have had to utilise some of our meeting rooms, conference rooms. We've also had to change the desks around so they're not directly facing anyone. So we've moved the desks, and there is opportunity to put in physical barriers. But at the moment, we've been quite lucky that we do have that little bit of room to manoeuvre, so we can put the desks so that people aren't facing each other. So we've also put up a lot of signage. So we've put up distance signs, so reminding staff that there is the 2-metre distance. So that's a good visual reminder for them. I know it can be tough to remember. We're quite handsy people sometimes. I think that's just general human nature to just be quite close and personal. We've also put up a lot of hygiene signs. So obviously hygiene is vital at the moment, with the message, wash your hands for 20 seconds more often, or use hand sanitizer. So we've put in hand sanitizing stations on arrival to work. This is so you've got that instant clean hands as soon as you come in, and that's another good visual reminder for them that they need to clean. So we're also sending out regular memos as well. So that stops complacency. So people are constantly thinking about it, because we don't want people to stop at the moment. We've also been discouraging movement around our site. So we've limited travel, actively encouraging video conferencing. There's also, we have a lot of internal meetings ourselves. So there is that message that we can have meetings outside, just not for as long as we probably used to do. So those 3-hour meetings are now a thing of the past. We've introduced maximum occupancy for some of our rooms. So our kitchens are tiny, our toilets are small. So we've made them 1 in, 1 out, just to make sure that there isn't that risk of crossing people. We've also reminded staff to make sure that they make their own drinks as well in the kitchen, so they're not making drinks rounds for everyone. So you might need to remind the colleagues that never make the drink to rehydrate. Another thing we've been looking at is staggering arrival and departure times. Something that we haven't really had to introduce at the moment because we've still got quite a lot of people working from home and obviously on furlough. But something we do introduce or do have anyway is staggered break times. That's just so that we have general good coverage of our offices and warehouses at all times. We are also limiting our number of visitors. So we do have contractors coming in and out. So we've included in our induction process for our contractors a bit on COVID-19. So obviously that'll be different for each and every organisation, but we ask them that they sign for that as well, as part of the normal induction process. So one of the major things that we do here as we're transport and warehousing is that we handle cargo. We handle a lot of cargo, so we've had to think about our procedures for unloading containers and lifting, manual handling. So we've had to redesign some of our procedures and think about any engineering controls that we can put in place to stop 2 people from being in an enclosed space. Also, like Steph said, well-being. So this is a hot topic, just making sure that the managers are speaking to staff regularly. And a term that we've seen our solicitors use is the reluctant returner. So anxiety about returning to work. So we haven't seen it yet. I'm sure we will. So it's something that we will listen to them. We will discuss with them the measures we've put in place. We can put in all the reassurance that we can. But like Steph said, it might be at the end of the day you need to remind them of the home truths. And also monitoring. So everything needs to be monitored. It's just like normal day-to-day business. Any health and safety manual will say that you need that monitoring in place. So that's the standard for us, monitoring everything that they do. For us, we haven't put in any testing, so any temperature testing or anything like that at the moment. We don't see it as reasonably practical for us. It could be for other smaller organisations, but for us, not at the moment. We could go back and look into it, but we have around about 7 different entrances, 2 different locations as well. So not only in Southampton, we have our Derby office. So we probably require about 6 full-time staff to do any temperature testing for us. So not something we're doing at the moment. So PPE, something that we have introduced is PPE. Gloves, face masks. This is for our public-facing staff, so our drivers, our guys in the warehouse. What I will say though is we and everyone should introduce a good safe system of work for that. They need to know how to fit, how to use, how to keep good hygiene, how to make sure that they remove face masks properly, remove gloves properly, and then dispose of them safely. So a good safe system of work, signed for, just so that they know what they're doing and what these gloves and what these face masks mean. But good hygiene definitely is one for them. Definitely keep on with the good hygiene. And then step 4, record your findings. So the government advice is to publish your risk assessment on your website. That's something we've done with the help of Carswell Gould. So feel free to head over there to download it. I've put the web address on our slide so you can have a look and download it yourself and have a read. And review. So keep up to date with any government guidance. We've been watching the daily briefings, reading up on the government web pages. We've found that our solicitors and our insurers have also offered quite invaluable information. They are just brilliant. Obviously, sometimes you might have to pay for that information, but it really does help to get that. And just to emphasise something that Steph said, communication. The key for us is to keep our staff regularly updated with what's happening, whether it's good or bad, or giving them an opportunity for an open discussion with their line managers. Communication is definitely the key. Right, so thank you for having me today. I'm sure none of this is new to you, but I do hope I've given you some insight into what we're doing and perhaps some food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Well, that's fascinating. It's really always interesting to hear how companies are addressing challenges and implementing ways of working that are so different to what we've seen before. Amy, just one question I think that I've got first and foremost, if you don't mind, is you mentioned specifically around face masks, and it's something that I imagine Meach has risk assessed in terms of the use of face masks and the hygiene elements around that. Is there any place that you could direct businesses to go to if they are wanting specific guidance about the use of face masks and in which scenarios face masks may be better to be used than perhaps in others? Also guidance to how to apply face masks in a hygienic and safe way?
So the government guidance, the working safety with COVID-19 government guidance is spot on. It's got full guidance with how to then put on the face mask, removal, and things to think about as well. So definitely look at the government guidance. HSC will probably have some guidance too, but the government have put it all nicely in one document, depending on your business as well. You may need, like us, 3 of the guidances, but yeah, definitely look at the working safely with COVID-19 guidance.
And if you were to identify, say, your top 3 tips for preparing a workplace, you've gone through many suggestions in your presentation, but if you were to pick the top 3, what would they be?
Definitely start with your risk assessment. Definitely, that's going to be individual to you. It may not be that you need to review your workplace because you're already quite socially distanced or you're already working from home. Start with the risk assessment, but obviously social distancing, hygiene.
Okay, very clear. Thank you. Again, if anyone on the call has any questions, please do use the public chat. We have a few questions that have been submitted in advance. And Steph, one, I don't mind if you would pick up here, and possibly Amy, you might have a viewpoint as well, which is, we've talked a couple of times today, you've mentioned about employees and perhaps their their feelings about coming back to work. We use the phrase the reluctant returner, or possibly those who see themselves as vulnerable, or perhaps living with vulnerable relatives at home. Possibly they prefer the home working environment and don't even want to come back to work. Could we talk a little bit more around how to encourage or how to manage that situation where, for any reason, people are maybe less or more reluctant rather to come back to work than they might otherwise have been? Steph?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a challenge that I think nearly every organisation is going to face, and I think it goes back to some of the things we talked about in the presentation. It's understanding that every individual is different. I always like a kind of a quote that I've seen recently around a poem, which is that we're not all in the same boat, but we're in the same storm, and everybody's set of circumstances is different. And I think as an employer, if you can communicate as much as possible, if you can understand people's circumstances, if you can understand their fears and their concerns, and then try and alleviate those if you can, and then try and work together to reach an agreeable solution, then you're going to get much more commitment and buy-in from that individual. There will always be a proportion of individuals who, I kind of talked about carrot before. By default, there's always a proportion of your workforce which you'll need to stick, and sometimes it's just making sure that they realise that at the end of the day they have got a commitment to you as an employer. If they don't want to fulfil that commitment going forward, then that's a different type of conversation you need to have with them.
And Amy, is that something that you've encountered, the possibility that people, for whatever reason, have decided that coming back to work is not something that they're too comfortable with?
We haven't yet, no. I'm sure we will. I'm 100% sure that we will. But like I said, it's just a case of you need to talk to your staff, you need to communicate, you need to let them know what you've done, and provide them with every reassurance, some support. But like I said, like Steph said as well during hers, it might come down to the fact that there's some home truths. They might not want to be on SST. So.
Thank you. And one point that you also both picked up was around mental health. It links to that question there. Are there any specific approaches or anything different that organisations should be doing now with reference to employees' mental health, maybe compared to where things were before the COVID-19 crisis came? Steph, would you be able to give any viewpoints on that as to obviously the importance of mental health, but also whether any things are different now as to maybe where they were before?
Well, I think generally over the last 10, specifically 5 years, we've all as a kind of nation become much more aware and appreciative of mental health challenges, and people are much more open about talking out about them now. So I think it's a really good position to kind of be starting with. I think the challenge we have going forward is that we don't yet know what that's going to look like. We don't know whether there's going to be impact on children from an emotional development perspective, not interacting with their peer group, coming out the other side around, whatever the new normal looks like. Some people will really struggle from the isolation. Some people really prefer it. So it's I think the one thing we're going to see is more mental health problems. We don't yet know how they're going to demonstrate themselves. Our advice as an employer is, previously, even if you were a small employer, was to have an employee assistance program. Certainly, if you were ever to get a stress claim from an employment tribunal, you can only really successfully defend them if you have an employee assistance program in place. Personally, I wouldn't do it for those reasons. I'd actually do it for the practical one, in that if you again communicate them, they're great for posters on the back of the toilet door, because people don't tend to talk about when they use them, but the fact that they're available 24/7 for employees to ring up and get advice. So if they are having money worries which they don't want to talk about openly, or they are struggling to get out of bed in the morning, or they are feeling really low, or they've got real concerns, they can ring someone that's independent of your organisation and get some professional advice, and your employer will never know about that. It's a completely confidential service. So I think my one take from this is it's not a great investment. You can for a couple 10, 20 employees, you could be looking at cover for £500 a year. So you're not talking huge quantities, but actually you get something really valuable. I'm just personally think that it's absolutely invaluable for organisations to have some methodology by where they can say to employees, actually, do you know what, we've got a service that supports you.
A good investment to make. Amy, I wonder if you could pick up this question that came in prior to the session today. The question is, and you mentioned sort of social distancing in office spaces and some areas where that's less easy, specific sort of kitchens, toilets, these sorts of things. And the question is, any recommendations you might have for an office space where social distancing is not always possible, but where the employees do want to come back, so they're keen to get back to work. How can you ensure, maybe just picking up on some of the points in your presentation, that we can enable them to come back safely without bringing the risk of spreading a virus around the workplace?
Of course. So basically, they obviously need to come to the office. So just rearranging your desks. You could make them so that they're not if they're facing each other, then make them so they're not facing each other if possible, and then put up a barrier, some sort of guard or something, so that, you know, like a sneeze screen, things like that. Or do they have a meeting room? Do you have a room that you use largely for visitors? And now obviously we're not having visitors, so you could potentially put a couple of people in there. It might mean that you need to get contractors in to make sure that works, to put data points in and things like that, or you've got Wi-Fi, brilliant. But just try and utilize what you've got, and yes, you might need to buy some sort of barrier, some protection.
So some creative thinking about how to make the most of your workplace to
Exactly.
bring people back to work safely. I was just going to put a question out to the audience, really, and happy to take any thoughts back on the public chat. And the question is one that came in before the session. I think it was very well put, which is, and it was addressed to the panel, but I think we can direct it back out to the audience, which is, does the panel or the audience think that businesses in the South will be more or less impacted than other geographic locations due to the high volume of leisure and travel businesses still affected by lockdown? I think that's a very relevant question when we look across our region and we see the amount of businesses involved in specific sectors. So if anyone's got any thoughts on that, I'd be really interested to see any views from those listening in today on the public chat. We're getting towards the end, but I did want to get one further area in, which is about the furlough scheme. And Steph, you were kind enough to really bring that into focus at the start of your presentation there. If and this is a question that's been submitted by one of the attendees beforehand, they're in a situation where they furloughed 35% of their staff, so they have 65% of their staff in work, but they're able to operate at 100% capacity. So they've realised, I suppose, an opportunity, and to use your phrase earlier of starting to move into right sizing capability. Is there any guidance, and just to pick up some of the points that you made already, as to what the best way might be to proceed when the outcome they're finding from lockdown is actually an increased level of productivity?
Yeah, I'd say that they're not alone. I think it's something we've come across in a number of situations whereby organisations have really been quite shocked where they've furloughed a proportion, but actually their output is exactly the same. Obviously, probably sends a message that they do need to do something in terms of the structure of their organisation. So as I say, that the planning aspect is really important. If you are going to go down the redundancy route, I would always do all your preparation up front before you kind of start talking. I mean, legally, you do have to consult with people the moment you make that strategic decision to consider redundancy. So, but it's understanding what that communication is going to look like, who's going to do it, what timescale you're going to do, are you going to offer outplacement, are you going to offer anything above statutory redundancy, and so on. And have your ducks all lined up ready to go if you're going to need to do it, and plan that consultation effectively. Places where organisations go wrong when they make redundancies, if you're going to end up in an employment tribunal, it tends to be because they don't think about the roles that are going to be made redundant. Quite often they will pick the individual, so it's understanding that it is a role that gets made redundant. So if you've got a secretary over in manufacturing but you've got a secretary in finance, then actually you probably need to put your secretaries in a pool and then decide on your selection criteria as who's going to go. So it's making sure that you have the right pools and you put those people in the right pools, making sure that you talk to people and you have records of those consultation steps, and then making sure you have a fair selection criteria, and something like a simple matrix, point scoring, make it as objective as possible. If you want to use something like disciplinary, great. If you can use absence, think about, make sure you don't disadvantage somebody who's got a disability, so you might want a factor to prorata according to anybody who's got that. Certainly you wouldn't use anything that's maternity related absence, you'd exclude that from any scoring. But think about objective measures you've got that says, this is one I would give this person a 1 or a 2 in this area, and likewise I'd get a different score. You only ever need to share, if asked by the individual, their score. You don't need to share everybody else's, but again, it's just going through the mechanics of those things so that you know that you have got everything lined up ready to go, so that if you ever did get a challenge, you can say genuinely, we did this properly.
And very briefly, if you could, if people have been found to have worked whilst on furloughs, contravening the rule, what would the situation be there? And in addition, how therefore do people maintain links with their customers whilst they're furloughed? What would the guidance be there to not break the rules?
Yeah, I mean, that was a question that we got a lot in the very early days. The importance of furlough is that you should not be working. There are government guidelines where you can, as an employee, you can now report your employer for doing that. And I think, going forward, certainly if you have employers who are disengaged, they are more likely to make a complaint against you. It's very clear in the furlough scheme that you cannot do anything that encourages development or business of your business. Even individual directors can be furloughed. They can obviously carry out their statutory duties, but they can't do any business development. So, if it's a case of you want somebody to do something, you need to unfurlough them and bring them back to work. And obviously the risk is that fundamentally, if you're getting an employee to work whilst they are furloughed, then you are committing fraud against HMRC. So, you need to sort that out very quickly.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to 1:30. It's brought us to the end of this session of the Southampton series of the Chamber of Commerce, and specifically the Southampton Chamber of Commerce briefings. I'd like to say thank you certainly to Amy and to Steph for their really interesting presentations today, and also for the answers to the various questions that they've been able to give. Thank you very much for that. I'd also like to point out, as you can see on this slide here, that the next session in the Southampton series is next Thursday. It's not actually the 28th of May, that's today. So it's next Thursday, which I think is the 4th of June. And that session is mental toughness, which will be a very interesting review, picking up a couple of the points we talked about today about mental health and the implications for employees as they return back to their workplace and how to manage that. So that's all from us. Thank you very much for listening. It just remains, on behalf of Amy, on behalf of Steph, on behalf of the Southampton Chamber of Commerce, just to say thank you very much for tuning in. Stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you all again next week. Thank you.